Food is central to our lives. Every day, we consume such a variety of food that we almost take it for granted. Biologically, there is no way of avoiding it, so it is important to look at where food comes from. How many times have you actually noticed someone eating or drinking in a movie or book? It's an action that we often overlook, so when food is mentioned as often as it is in the Canterbury Tales, we have to take note. It gives the characters more dimension, and we'll be looking into the significance of foods such as bread, wine, ale, meats, poultry, fish, and spices. As talked about in class, the diets of each social class varied greatly, and much more dramatically between the peasants and the upper classes, the clergy and the nobles. However, there were staple foods that everyone shared in common, but what differed was the quality of these foods. These are referred to as staple foods, and changes in the supply of these goods affected every citizen. The two most common staple foods were bread and wine. Bread was the most commonly consumed food, as grain, barley, and wheat were the most abundant crops in Europe at the time. These are starches, which are much more hardy than other vegetables, so peasants could survive on bread alone. Bread was so important that laws were passed to regulate the production and sale of it, called the assize of bread. For drink, wine was more popular than water, and there were different types of wine for different parts of the day. Sometimes it was watered down, but not entirely, so drinking a lot of wine would not always result in intoxication. More often it was just spiced for different meals. They also had different ales for different purposes, such as porter and stouts for nutritional value. There is one more important component to the medieval diet, and that's spices. We can't say these were a staple food because not everyone had them, and those who did were seen as higher up in the social class. A peasant who had saffron was unimaginable. Saffron is actually still pricey today, around $1,800 for a pound. But a peasant who had a spice like paprika was seen as pretty well off, and would likely be part of the rising middle class of Chaucer's time. The basic spice was black pepper, used by all social classes if you could afford it, but less commonly the higher in social class you look, because they had more variety. Spices were so significant that the sale of anise, cubeb, and licorice actually funded repairs of the London Bridge. Pepper could have also been used to pay rent, and occasionally it was actually required by the landlord. The most important use for spices wasn't as it is today, to enhance flavors, but rather to mask spoiled foods, so essentially hiding bad flavors. The necessity to mask the off flavors of spoiled foods was routine for the lower classes, as very few preservation techniques were available to anyone at the time, let alone the poor. Typically, meats and such were salted to preserve it for as long as possible. Some other uses of spices include being the essence of personal luxury and an important part of public functions, banquets, and parties. Spices were used in perfumes, especially cardamom, cassia, cinnamon, and sweet marjoram seeds for their sweet aromas. Some common aphrodisiacs were anise, basil, fennel leaves, coriander, and garlic. Spice-scented oils were used to soothe the skin, and as aforementioned, wines were commonly flavored with spices. It also had medicinal uses, as spices were used to heal the sick and wounded. Now you can see why costly spices were the most desirable gifts. In one monastery, Marjorie Jenkins writes about the culinary utilization of spices and their medicinal uses by monks. The most common spices for them, members of the clergy and the upper class, were ginger, pepper, nutmeg, mace, cloves, and interestingly enough, saffron. In the years right after Chaucer's death began the Age of Discovery. At this time, the Indian spice trade flourished across both the Silk Road and the maritime trade routes that connected Europe with Asia. Exotic spices such as clove, nutmeg, and mace were brought over. Mace was 4 shillings and 7 pence, quite expensive for the time. Ginger was 1 shilling, and cumin was 2 pence. Though Chaucer could not have written about this new age of spices with more availability and more variety, readers of his work would have been living in such a moment of spice splendor. Thus, his integration and highlighting of the importance of spices made all the difference on the impact of the reader. Now that we know what the early medieval diet consisted of, we can talk about what it lacked. Bluntly, there wasn't much of anything else for the peasants. Having a different meal for dinner every day was rare, and usually reserved for the upper classes. A peasant's diet consisted of bread, some vegetables, and usually some sort of broth or soup that consisted of whatever food items were available and were boiled together. We can see the implications of this in the Franklin's prologue, because although he was well off, he does not hold a title and still belongs to the middle class. Yet he was able to achieve such a variety of foods that Tip will talk about in a little bit. In terms of the future, this expansion of foods is what extended the life expectancy rates of both men and women as their vitamin and mineral consumptions increased. Numerically, this progress in food can be shown through these statistics, and food allowances in 1424 included 40% bread, 4% oats, 23% malt, 23% meat, 3% fish, and 7% dairy. In class, I'll have some graphs to visually show you just how many times these categories of food appeared in the Canterbury Tales.